The Zarlum Chronicles, Episode 2, Part 4.
With the apes finally beginning to take shape, they were gaining more intelligence, not just in terms of biological evolution, but social intelligence. Before they were simple beasts, however, as time went on, they started caring about each other more and learning more social aspects of what will one day become a society. They were even improving their communication skills. Most creatures living on Zarlum simply survived. However, the zurms were surprisingly unique, having the ability to not just survive, but also live happily. This was why they were so high up above everything else, and why they ruled over everything else on Zarlum. Before they even gained the power they have now, which is surprisingly impressive considering where they are right now. However, the zurms weren't all-powerful. They did still have problems, like everything else.
After about 2,000 years of survival, they were still living in the trees and hunting, but they were getting smarter and smarter every year. They were getting better at hunting, forming into groups for specific tasks, and communicating the exact task. They did still have a lot of problems, such as fighting each other for the luxury of survival, trying to take the best areas to live, not realizing that every time they managed to grab some land perfect for survival, two things would happen. Either predators would arrive and hunt them out of the area, or other people would take it over and kick them out, only for the same two things to happen. However, some problems never changed.
There was a very large difference in the zurms that would change everything, giving them a huge advantage over all other beings and laying the foundation for what they will one day become. They were finally given the unique ability to walk on two legs. It was only just the start. They still had to run like gorillas or chimpanzees. However, it was a huge start, and their bodies were beginning to adapt better and better to walking. Eventually, they would be able to run. Their hips and legs were constantly changing, along with their feet and even their spines, constantly making it easier.
One day in the middle of a field. It was the middle of summer. The grass had grown extremely high. The sun was glazing down upon a huge herd of deer, which were happily grazing the grass and looking around just in case of any predators. However, they clearly weren't watching very carefully, because despite the fact they were scanning the trees, multiple pairs of eyes were watching them. Suddenly, to their horror, they heard a loud, high-pitched howling from behind some trees and bushes. The deer all poked their heads up, their ears moving around, trying to detect the slightest sound.
To them, it could have been two things. Either something far away from them and nothing to worry about because it was nothing to do with them, or it could have been something right next to them, trying to make them run into a trap. And that got them into a pickle, because they were the two things they hoped it was. Because if not, it was a group of people right next to them, and they were about to attack. However, if it wasn't, and they ran, that was actually what the people would want them to do. But if they stayed, it would also be what they wanted. So they had no idea what to do. They just had to look out over the bushes and trees for any movement, hoping they did the right thing. However, in this world of survival and hunting, a sitting duck is a dead one.
Suddenly, before they could move, a long wooden spear went directly through the back of one of their heads, killing the poor animal instantly. The others quickly turned around, preparing to run, however, saw the apes coming from behind the trees throwing more spears. They also started using some of their new weapons, one of which being a bow and arrow, another being a large net, which they used as a kind of barrier to help move the herd in the correct direction, and also confuse them. If they got close enough, they would use the net for their proper purpose, trapping them. The deer were absolutely terrified and began charging away quickly, some stumbling and tripping over themselves in a panic, desperately trying to escape the zurm hunters.
The apes took that opportunity to kill the fallen with knives, while the others got away. However, the zurms didn't care because they had enough already. The apes that caused the sound that got their attention came from their hiding spot and started making sure the deer were dead,
If they weren't, they got knives, killing them by stabbing them in the throat. The apes had started wearing a form of clothes, items like belts and harnesses to hold different items, such as knives, arrows, and pouches made out of animals. They had started using all the animals' components, not just the meats. They used the skin for clothing and housing. They even used the bones as tools.
The rules of society had changed a bit since the days of the rats. Before, they had to do trials and challenges to decide who would be the next leader. However, with the apes, they had leaders in multiple different areas, such as hunters, gatherers, guards, then a large leader above them all. And it was no longer done through challengers and trials. It was simply the eldest of the group, because, in theory, they would have the most experience. The eldest hunter came from behind a rock, walking over to the hunters. He was different to the others. He was covered in scars and even war paint. He was about to check how many they had when he heard a sound from the rocks, and easily had enough experience to know exactly what that sound meant and what to do.
The leader swiftly started yelling, waving its arms around in a warning to the others. 5 of them turned to the oncoming danger immediately, grabbing their spears and daggers. The others grabbed the deer and started pulling them away as a massive saber-tooth came round the corner, sniffing the ground, snarling angrily, being bought over by the smell of fresh food, which they knew was always a possibility. But the question was, what were they going to do about it? 4 apes, including the leader, ran forward, beginning to scream at it to try and scare it off. Unlike their former ancestors, they would at least try peace. However, when it started roaring at them and approaching, they had no other choice than to engage it. Luckily, they knew what they were doing. 4 apes went to it, surrounding it, moving with as much speed as they could to scare it. They then proceeded to start stabbing it in the shoulders, trying to stay behind it so it didn't attack them with its claws, or, more importantly, its teeth. The apes were really fast and were able to change direction faster than the saber-tooth, so overwhelming it was extremely easy. Eventually, the saber-tooth realized that it wasn't going to win that fight, so it turned running away. The apes knew that it was going to die from the fact it had spears pointing out of it. They started following it for a very important reason. When it finally fell dead, they took the spears out of it, then removed its teeth to make more spears. The leader also started skinning it, so it could have a trophy for having killing it. The ape society seemed to run on respect, and respect came from whoever had the biggest and most insane trophy of anyone else.
Now the world of Zarlum wasn't just full of ordinary animals and creatures. It was full of dangerous monsters that had evolved alongside the zurm. For example, the person back at the home came with the biggest trophy was a zurm who possessed the skull and the scales of a dragon and a giant spider. However, it had gone into retirement. There, dangerous creatures were rare and only seemed to live in certain spots, so as long as they stayed out of those areas, they would be totally fine. The apes started heading back to the cave. In the old days, they used to walk through the tall grass, which was full of dangers and things designed to murder you. So what the zurm had done was cave out paths through the grass, placing stones around them to prevent the grass coming through. These would form into the first ever roads. They would be used for protection and for guidance in case a zurm ever got lost trying to get home.
Another improvement to the zurms was the fighting. There were sometimes fights over land, but most zurms would treat seeing others as an opportunity to build their tribes even bigger. Finally, the apes got back to their home cave. The cave was enormous. They had used tools to carve out the cave to make it more smooth, so they could sleep in it, and carve it out to be so much larger with tunnels and huge opened-up areas. They had also placed out different areas for work, such as creating tools, cooking food, and looking after children, giving jobs to people, and beginning to create a civilization. There were at least 1,000 apes inside the cave, and even more outside, who had built their own little huts made of animal hide. Across the cave were also multiple drawings made with chalk, which historians would always be fascinated with. However, the people used them to just show off to the other apes. The drawings were effectively what a supercar is today, just showing off what others probably won't ever have.
When the apes returned, their families came over to help them with the food and check they were okay. The hunter leader immediately went over to the grand leader to inform him of what had happened with the cat. The leader was a little disappointed because they could have done something they had mastered a few hundred years before: tamed it. They had learned that it was incredibly difficult, but if they trapped an animal for long enough and trained them, the animal would start doing what they asked. Some even owned giant herds of deer so they wouldn't have to go and hunt them down. They would just be outside in rudimentary pens. They began to cook the deer and portion the meat out to apes around the cave, which was surprisingly difficult, considering there was 1,000 of them. However, having just the one hunting party would be extremely unintelligent. There were at least 20 spread throughout small groups. If one hunting party disappeared, 2 more would be sent to the sector the first was meant to go to. Because of that, they easily had enough to feed everyone in the cave. The elder went over to the highest rock in the area, looking over the camp, making sure everyone was there, and was happy to see not only was everyone there, everyone was happy and spending time with their families. The zurm really had learned to exist beyond other creatures constantly fighting and killing each other, and the leader was very happy to see the progression. Night began to fall. The grand leader and the other lower leaders headed to the very top of the mountain to sit doing one of their favorite things, watching the sunset. It was always beautiful, especially with a shockingly beautiful view and seeing the animals. They then enjoyed watching the sky, the beautiful stars and galaxies they could all clearly see. It was almost art to them. Once the sun had set, and they had watched the stars for long enough, it was beginning to get dark, so they retreated back down the mountain. When they arrived, the other apes were lighting fires and standing torches around the camp to make it easier to see. Most families were sat around the fire chatting, some sleeping, but most just relaxing. The elder went over to his personal fire to sit with his family. When he realized he had to check everyone. Despite there being hundreds, he was perfect at telling when someone was or wasn't there. After a minute of looking over the area, he noticed that, worryingly, someone was missing. And even worse, it was a child that wasn't in the cave. The elder wasted no time in grabbing a horn. It began howling and making low grunting sounds, communicating, pointing for them to go and find the child. It knew that the child wouldn't live very long if they didn't find it soon. The grand leader was angry it got out in the first place. However, there was no time to deal with that. He jumped down and ran down to the security, who were already preparing, calmly. However, the others weren't so calm. The apes began to panic, grabbing their spears, knowing that the nights around Zarlum were dangerous, because that was when the biggest creatures came out to play. And it got very cold very quickly. The youngster wasn't going to last very long. A team of 7 apes swiftly sprinted out the cave, retrieving their spears and rocks, or just anything they could use to defend themselves and find the child. They immediately jumped onto trees, beginning to jump across the branches as to have a better view of the land. One of the apes on the ground noticed tracks on one of the roads of the child and what looked like a mouse, and was able to determine that the curious child must have noticed a mouse or a small rat and followed it out the cave. The tracks led towards a field that immediately told them where to start searching. They climbed and jumped towards the field. After a few seconds, one of them shrieked down to the others, indicating she had seen the youngster. With the child being seen, they jumped down out of the tree immediately, heading towards the child in a panic, hoping nothing was going to happen. In theory, the child hadn't bothered anything or made any noise, so they should be fine. However, life didn't really work in that way. When they arrived at the border of the field, it was already too late for the young child. All the noise they had made from the panicking had disturbed a huge horned rhino, which came lumbering out of a bush, slowly grazing. The rhino had poor vision. However, when it looked up, it could barely see the child with its blurry vision. The shrieking from the others gave it the wrong idea, making it believe it was the child making those sounds. So it immediately identified the child as a threat.
The angry rhino started pawing the ground, throwing up a lot of dust in an attempt to scare the child away. However, the child was watching it, absolutely frozen in fear. The rhino saw the child not moving and decided it had been threatened enough, so prepared to charge. The rhino started charging forward, shaking the leaves from the trees with its massive, thudding footsteps. The child became instantly frozen with fear, like a deer in headlights, because it knew it was too late. If it were to run, the rhino would just chase it and not stop until the child was dead. The apes ran from the trees, yelling and screaming, trying to get its attention, hoping that if they grabbed its attention, it would stop and go for them. They could distract, then someone else could get the child, and everything would be fine. However, it didn't listen, or just didn't care about them. It had a target, and it wasn't changing for anything. The apes tried to run forward, throwing their spears, but it didn't make a difference. They either missed, or their spears weren't strong or sharp enough to pierce through the animal's thick hide. To the horror of the apes, the rhino plowed directly into the child, which threw the child high into the air, flipping twice. Then it landed hard, smacking its head on the ground, cracking its skull open, resulting in its blood to go everywhere. It screeched in pain, then stopped moving, its body falling limp almost instantly. They hoped it was dead so it didn't suffer, but they were unable to go and check because the rhino was still walking around and it was simply too dangerous. However, that didn't matter to one of the apes who was standing on the tree.
The mother of the child started screaming and yelling, charging forward, with little regard for her safety or survival in the slightest. She was more concerned with her child. The others tried to stop her, but it was no use. As the mother escaped their grip, the leader realized he should have anticipated this response from her. The mother continued running, desperate to get to her child. However, due to her mournful screams, the rhino turned its attention to her. The rhino wasted no time, charging towards her, angrily grunting. It whacked her aside as easily as kicking a football. The mother flew high into the air, being instantly impaled by a sharp tree branch. It tried to struggle out of its trap, insistent on still getting to the body of her son. However, sadly, it was already too late for her as well. She slowly died, having no idea if her child survived the rhino or not. The rest watched on in horror, being unable to do anything. Usually, they would respectfully bury their dead. However, with the rhino on high alert and being incredibly dangerous, they retreated back to the cave. The leader was usually not violent. However, other times, such as this time, punishment had to be enacted. He marched over to the ape who was supposed to look after the youngsters and swiftly smacked them to the ground, then proceeding to kick them. He then beat down upon them over and over again. By the end, the ape was alive. They were covered in blood and injuries, but they were alive and demoted, and the leader quickly put someone else in charge of looking after the children, making it clear that not one child would leave the cave unattended, especially not at night, because it was dangerous.
The leader laid down with his wife and children that night, feeling horrible. He didn't like to be hard on his people, but sometimes he had to be. If he wasn't, then things like today's events would happen again and again. He had to make his people realize that just because they were evolving
That did not mean the world was a soft and gentle place. And he knew that better than most. The next morning, the apes gathered the bodies of both the mother and the son, bringing them over to their burial site, respectfully burying them and holding a ceremony. They even placed down things such as flowers and other items, hoping nothing like this would ever happen again. A few thousand years later, they had advanced even further. Zarlum was still a surprisingly hot planet, and the heat wouldn't be disappearing anytime soon. It was just the way the planet was going to be for thousands of years. Until something was on its way to change all that, and it would change Zarlum forever. In the meantime, the zurms were free to evolve and push themselves even further. It took them thousands of years for them to eventually shed their thick fur, and they began to change their face structure and shapes to look more human, despite not being humans because of their multiple small differences. When they changed the shape of their heads, their hands and feet began to follow, which eventually allowed them to make one of their biggest changes, being able to stand perfectly upright all the time, even during running, because their balance had been greatly improved from their spine and pelvis. With these new changes came the need to improve upon their clothing, meaning they needed to begin wearing clothing. Beforehand, they had thick hair that covered everything. However, without it, they weren't as protected, and they felt they had to start covering themselves up socially. Clothing actually allowed them to also express themselves, because the people with different hides were valued or seen differently. This was almost the first signs of what the zurm would master in the future: corruption. Sometimes people would steal from others, and the leaders would not do much because the people stealing were higher up anyway. It was an incredibly cruel system, and one day, hopefully it would even out a little bit. They also started forming brand new tools which were far more superior and lasted longer. The zurm were beginning to lock in some of their future traits, and almost looking exactly how they should in the future, just dumber and less civilized. The zurm were different from human beings because their average height was taller with males and females, males standing at an average of 6'1" and females standing at an average of 5'9". They were also stronger but didn't always look stronger. Their muscles were just biologically made to be stronger. They had increased speed and stamina, and of course, they have massive amounts of knowledge, using that knowledge to create more weapons and tools, which they would use to dominate the land bit by bit. Around this period of time, they were no longer known as just apes. They had managed to evolve to basic cavemen. Around this time period, the zurms created fire for the first time, which was one of the most important leaps in their history. What they didn't realize was the heat was an illusion, and a deadly illusion at that. They were getting into thin clothes of animal hide and basking in the heat of the world, having no idea what horror was about to descend on them from above, shooting across the sky to change to their world. Just like how the dinosaurs had a little delivery from above, the zurm were about to go through a fraction of what they went through. A few hundred years went by. A lone cave zurm was walking through the forest, cleaning his blade from a fresh kill, when a shadow fell over the world. Luckily, it wasn't a meteor. It was something so much more strange than that. The cave zurm watched as a massive white ball fell out of the sky, shooting towards the ground. It wasn't white because it was burning. Actually, the opposite. It was white because it was a huge ball of ice. It was extremely lucky that the enormous ball of ice didn't hit the mainland. The cave zurm ran out to the beach with other interested or scared zurm, seeing it slam into the ocean at the other end of the planet, where a large, uninhabited island about half the size of the mainland was formed millions of years before. The cave zurm watched as the enormous ball of ice crashed into the ocean. The moment it made impact, it sent a massive shockwave of ice spreading across the ocean extremely quickly. All the cavemen could do was watch the ice quickly approaching before being hit with it, killing them instantly. The ice continued into the mainland, slowing its progress, but covering almost half the mainland and the entire ocean. Thousands upon thousands of zurms were killed. Some were lucky, being frozen to death in seconds. Others died slow, painful deaths. The temperature of the entire planet lowered into the minus for the first time.
Those who did survive needed to evolve. And they needed to do it fast, or they were going to die. Future historians were worried about this part of history. They estimated that 98% of all zurms were wiped out. This was almost the extinction of the zurms. The weather of the planet was bringing disastrous effects. And even today, scientists still don't know why this happened. The zurms had no idea that deep under the ice was an alien that landed at the very center of the ice. She was what they would call an ice queen. However, she wasn't a threat yet because she was still in deep sleep. And yet her power had created all of this destruction and deep cold.
The weather changed so unnervingly fast. It went from one day of beautiful sun and beautiful views to white snow everywhere and a dead cold world. This would be known as the first major ice age. Most creatures were capable of adapting to the new, drastic change in weather. The large elephant creatures living closest to the new ice ocean began to grow more hairs and grow more fat, becoming mammoths. Most of them went straight to the iceland, walking through the oceans, eventually finding their home, where they still remain, even in the future, along with other creatures adapted to living in the cold. About 70% of the mammoths went straight to the iceland, while the other 30% stayed on the mainland, which was extremely lucky for the zurms because with the new cold, they really needed the mammoths for survival.
A few years after the ice arrived, a group of mammoths were slowly heading towards the iceland across the ocean. When the sun was beginning to set overhead, the mammoths knew how truly dangerous the nights were. The cold would plummet lower than even they could handle. They quickly headed for a forest, hiding and sleeping under trees. That's when the darkness truly hit. As the mammoths tried to sleep, they saw something that indicated incredible danger. Light. The mammoths roared to their feet, trying to move away. However, they were surrounded. Spears flew from all directions as the mammoths panicked, but the spears weren't sharp enough to get through their thick hides. However, the mammoths were tough beats, but the zurm knew that.
When the zurm were close enough, the mammoths could see they were wearing thick clothing, covering their entire bodies, including their faces. They kept pushing and poking the mammoths backwards with their spears, while shouting at the top of their lungs and keeping their distances. What the mammoths didn't know was the zurms were guiding them to a kill zone. After a minute, they finally managed to get the mammoths to a cliff. With nowhere for them to go, the zurms pushed the mammoths right to the edge, watching as they slipped and fell at least 100 feet. When enough were killed, they went down the cliff, killing the ones that hadn't died from the fall, and skinning them, taking their fur and enormous amounts of meat. But they couldn't stay long because wolves could arrive any moment and overpower them. When they gathered everything they needed, they started marching back through the cold tundra, trying to walk quickly. However, the snow and the wind were making it difficult. They were heading back towards their houses, hoping they could make it there, constantly looking around for predators. They were constantly looking around for anything dangerous. However, it wasn't a predator that brought them down. As they wandered through the snow, one of the men in the middle got slower and slower until he collapsed forward into the snow, not moving. Their cavemen rushed over, shaking him and trying to wake him up. However, it was no use. He wasn't waking up. And if they wasted time trying to revive him, they were all going to die. So they all had to turn and continue on without him.
They really wished to have buried him. However, the snow would take care of that, and they just couldn't waste the energy.
The cavemen returned home and explained to the caveman's wife and child what happened. They were sad and angry not because of what they did, but because of the fact they had to do it. Because this was the time they were living in. The snow was falling heavily now, so they quickly huddled together inside their huts made of mammoth hide to try and protect themselves. But even then, it wasn't enough. And if they tried to light a fire to keep warm, there was a chance it would set the small hut on fire. Then they would no longer have a hut, and they would be completely defenseless against the cold and die. So they had to just huddle together for warmth, thinking how horrible it must be for the man they had left behind. Made even worse because they would never know what happened to him. They hoped that he died out there. However, a few hours later, the man they left behind opened his frost-covered eyes. He slowly pushed the snow off himself, getting to his feet, seeing he had been abandoned. However, he wasn't shocked or angry about this. He put his arms around his chest to try and keep warm, beginning to walk through the snow. However, he was weak and terrified. He wasn't going to make it, but he pushed on, step by step, was progress in his mind. And it almost seemed like he was going to make it, having no idea he was being watched by many sets of hungry eyes, and they knew he was alone. The man turned, hearing the footsteps of beasts behind him, seeing through the wind and snow yellow dots running around. He removed a dagger from his pocket. If he was going to die, he was at least going to try and put up a fight against it with everything he had. However, he knew in his heart it was pointless. There were too many of them. He was alone. It was freezing cold, and he was already weak. But he still held his knife ready for anything. However, clearly he wasn't ready for everything. While he was distracted with the 3 wolves in front of him, another had been sneaking up behind him and tackled him to the ground by jumping on his back. He fell face first into the snow as the wolf bit into his back. The caveman quickly rolled over, punching the wolf in the face. He went to stab the wolf, however, it swiftly bit his wrist, making him yell out in pain. He used the arm its teeth were around, rolling, pulling the wolf with him, pinning it to the ground. He then punched it in the face twice. He went to grab his knife. However, the other wolves weren't just going to stand there and let another one of their kind be killed. So 2 wolves leaped forward, clamping their sharp teeth around his arms, pinning him to the ground. The third went over to the other, making sure it was okay. However, it was already getting up, ready to finish the kill. The 2 wolves leaped onto the man's stomach, beginning to chew down on his chest and stomach. He began to scream out in pain, being unable to do anything because he was held down by the 2 wolves holding his arms. He closed his eyes, being unable to cry because it would freeze too quickly. His breathing began to slow as the life left him. His last thought, before the wolves finished him off, was of his family back at home. When the man was dead, the other 2 wolves let go, and they started eating him, watching his red blood drip into the snow. And this was a very common occurrence. After almost 500 years of non-stop agonizing winter, where even summer was cold, there was barely enough time for the snow to melt before the snow would come again. It seemed things were changing. Zarlum had been fighting with the power of the sleeping queen all that time, and finally it managed to win, pushing all the ice back off the ocean and off the mainland, only keeping it to what was known as the Iceland. It was about a quarter the size of the mainland, made up of islands full of mammoth communities and ice zurms who had specifically evolved for the cold. And finally, the 500-year horror was over, and zurms were finally clear of it. Most of the zurms that lived on the planet had no idea that the Ice Queen was laying asleep under the snow, just waiting to be awoken. And one day, she would be. There were also other creatures asleep under the snow that were carried with the Queen. They wouldn't be able to sleep forever, but that was a problem for the future. What they would never know was the fact that the creatures didn't come from space. They were created by the ring inside the moon that created them, just so it could have some fun and cause some chaos.
With the planet finally calming down a bit.
The Zurm race had survived their trial of fire. Well, no trial by ice and snow, and during that time their intelligence had grown more and more. They were now possibly the smartest beings on Zarlum. Possibly the smartest thing they did was begin actually speaking, not just communicating and grunting and hoping for the best others would understand. They all spoke different, however, them listening to each other speak around them helped them to speak more and form many languages from words taken from other languages. As smart as the Zurm race were becoming, they were a bit lazy sometimes, and that trait would sadly be adapted and continue for the rest of all time. If a job needed doing, the Zurm had become experts in either giving it to others or trying to find the easiest way to do something with the least effort. However, they were improving upon this more and more. And surprisingly, it was actually making them more intelligent.
Just because the cold was over, that didn't mean they recovered quickly. They had gone from living in communities of thousands to hunting in small tribes consisting of 10 to 15 zurms. However, as the years went on, the tribe amounts would increase from just a few to well over a few thousand tribes all over the place. And soon, that would begin to change. The tribes were all over Zarlum, and that wasn't going to work in terms of survival at all. Luckily, they had abandoned their ape-like attitude of fighting for land long ago. That allowed any of the tribes to come together, to begin fighting and surviving as a team, realizing it wasn't themselves that were the problem, it was everything else. But if they got into enormous tribes and built their homes and territories bigger, everything else wouldn't be a problem, and they would rule over everything. Who knows? Maybe one day there wouldn't be any predators and any issues.
The giant tribes could have had hundreds of members, and others may have had thousands. They began to create large buildings made of wood, or sometimes stone, being the first actual buildings. They built areas for people to get food in mass production, such as making farmland for crops, or sometimes even cows, chickens, and other animals. People began to adopt dogs and use them as hunting tools, while also using them as friends and companions. At that point in history, they had evolved and adapted from many forms, but finally they were proper zurms. In no way were they the towering creatures they would become about 1,000 years later, however. They couldn't evolve any further. All they had to do now was wait for time and their intelligence to catch up. And there was nothing stopping it now. End of Episode 2, Part 4.